We're doing Elizabethan England, we're doing poverty in Elizabethan England. As part of that, if you're at home, what you're actually looking for is in your OneDrive folder, you go into Year 10, History, Term 6, it's Lesson 6. There are two resources, one is a PowerPoint, one is a Word document. The Word document is a photocopy of the textbook sheets that you'll need for this lesson. What we're looking at is why did poverty in Elizabethan England grow? Why were there more poor people in Elizabethan England? So, as I said, running through this very quickly for those people who are at home. First thing I want you to think about is if we're thinking of poverty in today's markets, so we're thinking of what poverty actually means to us, why are people poor? I want you to list the reasons why you think people are actually poor. And if you're watching the video at home, can I suggest that actually at this point, you pause it for 5 minutes and make a list of reasons why people are actually poor in today's society. If I just chuck it out to the class around me, give me some reasons why people are poor in today's society. Yeah?
They've come back from the military and haven't been able to get a job.
Okay, so some people who have not been able to get employment. Any other reason?
Some people have money got none left.
Okay, some people have just actually, they've just spent, things are more expensive. And actually, your demographic where you live is important because actually things are more expensive in certain areas of the country. So it's more expensive to live here than it is, say, for instance, in Scotland. So therefore, if you earn the same money here and you earn the same money in Scotland, you'll actually, here, have more things. To give you an example, my house and my best friend's house, he lives in Northern Ireland, cost exactly the same amount of money. My house is a 4-bedroom bungalow, just outside Canterbury. His house is a 6-bedroom mansion with 8 acres of land. They cost exactly the same amount of money. But because it's cheaper to live in Northern Ireland, his money goes further. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Right. Any other reason? Thinking about today's society. Something really important been happening over the last couple of months.
The government. Can you say about the government?
You can't say the government is important, but actually that's not what I'm getting at. That's not my point. If I put this on the board... Black Lives Matter. Why is that important?
Because they do matter.
Well, yes, they do. Yeah, granted. I was just taking that as a given. Why is that important in terms of poverty and poor people? Are black people more likely to be poor?
Yes.
So does race affect poverty?
Yeah.
Yes.
Why?
They're not given as more opportunities as we are.
Okay, so they're not given as much. They get the same thing from the States, generally speaking, but there are issues in there as well. But actually, do you think in this country it's still possible that actually if a black person and a white person goes for the same job, that the white person will get it because they're white?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, very much like that. Just as an example, and actually we're not a good example because we live in a very white populated area. Yeah, there are very few ethnic minorities within the Dover area. But name for me please any black teacher in the school.
What's his bloody name, Mr. Wheeler?
Language. You're on camera. But he's not black, is he?
No.
Have we got any black teachers?
No.
No. Now part of that is down to the area we live in, but actually my first ever school I worked in was in Pimlico, which is a 90% black and Muslim area. Not a single black teacher. Why? Less likely to go to university, less likely to actually step up into that kind of position. Make sense?
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Why are people poor? I just said about university. What do I mean if I talk about class?
A lot of money.
Sorry? Class is money. It's not just money based though, is it?
No, it's like intelligence and...
Not just intelligence, but that does come into it in some ways. It's your status. Yeah, it is. So for instance, if you're upper class, you're more likely to have a title, for instance, sir, a knighthood, that kind of thing. If you're middle class, you might have a lot of money and an education. If you are seen as lower class or working class, it means that actually you have a day job which you work in every day. Yeah? I would class myself as middle class. My parents would have classed themselves as working class. Particularly my father, he definitely came from a working class background. my mother came from a slightly better middle class background. Make sense? My children are definitely middle class. Why are my children definitely middle class?
Because you give them the best that you can.
I give them the best I can, but actually any working class family do that with complete pride.
They've probably grown up from what background, so
Who was the first person to go to university in my family?
You.
Yeah. Will my children both go to university? That's one of the differences in classes. Make sense? So all of those things lead to poverty. So that's the first thing we're looking at today. But we're looking at why poverty existed in Elizabethan times and why there were more poor in Elizabethan times. So just running through this very quickly. This is the 1570 survey which actually listed poor people. Why would 25% of people who are classed as poor be over the age of 60?
because they just can't get a job.
They cannot get a job. Why would 40% be under the age of 16? Can't get a job. You lot, because you fit into either the middle class or the working class background, back in 1570, would you have gone to school? No. So you would have been working. Would you have been working for money? Not likely. You might have been, if you were lucky, farming on your family farm. 66% were women. Does that shock you? For anyone at home and you who can't actually see this, this is an all-female class. I'm the only man in the room. I'm feeling slightly intimidated. So, why does it not shock you?
Because we have no rights.
Okay. Are they better now?
Not really.
I would say they're significantly better.
To perfection.
Are they equal?
No.
No. Again, I used the example with the other class. If you look around, just the head teachers of the local area, there's only one female head teacher. You think of the secondary head teachers in the Dover, Deal and Sandwich area, there's only one female head teacher. The other 5 are all male. Sorry? The other 5 are all male. And actually, we see that in businesses. I use teacher, but we see that all chief executives, the vast majority of them are male. You look at our prime ministers, we've only had 2 female prime ministers in this country. But actually that's pretty good, because if you look at America, America's yet to have a female president. So still, that idea of 66% of women being in poverty, that would still stand in today's society. Right. As I said, I'm moving through this very quickly. So, some Tudor mistakes, just to explain to people at home. The Tudors, local landowners would have had private armies. Henry VII wanted to get rid of private armies, mainly because private armies basically meant that people had their own armed force. And that was a threat to Henry VII, because of course if the landowners rose up against him, they had their armies that they could rise up against him with. So he tried to dispel, or tried to disband the private armies. And it worked very well, because the private armies were actually made, people who were professional soldiers were generally speaking poor. They were the professional soldiers. So with no army, they didn't have a job. Henry VIII closed all of the monasteries. So if you go to Canterbury, St Augustine's Abbey is now a ruin. It's a very nice ruin to visit, but it was a massive monastery, and they would look after the poorer classes. They would look after the low class people. And of course they didn't exist. There was less charity, which meant that actually the poor got poorer. And finally, Henry VIII debased coins. The word debased, anyone know what it means? It effectively means devalued them. How do you devalue coins? Sorry? No, nice try though. No. In today's society we would call it inflation. Now you'll all have heard your parents say this. At some point they'll pick up a Mars bar and say, I can remember when you could buy this for 20 pence. Heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is inflation. Over time things get more expensive. The value of money lessens slightly. And actually we see money go out of print. So for instance, there's talk over the last few years about the idea of actually, should we get rid of pennies? Should we get rid of 5 pences? Because they're not worth that much. What's the point in actually having them anymore? Yeah. But back when I was a child, if my mother, and I'm not kidding, gave me 5 pence, I could actually go and buy a pack of crisps. I could walk into the sweet and pick up penny chews. Penny chews don't cost a penny anymore. You can't buy penny chews. Makes sense? So inflation, but actually what we then have is hyperinflation. If you put lots of money into a system, then things become more expensive to buy. And if the poor don't have lots of money, they then can't buy them. So they become more poor. Makes sense? I used an example with the other class for that as well. that actually it's also about how much those things are worth to people. So for instance, face masks are now more expensive, nearly 3 times more expensive than they were a year ago. Hand sanitizer is nearly 10 times more expensive than it was a year ago. Because of the value in today's society, because of the need of that product. Makes sense though, doesn't it? Makes sense. Not necessarily right, but it makes sense. Right, other things that actually happened, the harvest failed for 4 years in a row. Why would that affect poor people in particular?
We'll be able to grow plants.
Yeah, a lot of them, particularly those who actually live in the countryside, relied on farming their own food. If they couldn't farm their own food, if they couldn't produce their own food, they didn't eat. And that was an issue. They didn't have money, they didn't have monetary coins, they relied on their own produce. And they relied on that produce to sell to get money. And they were smallholders. Smallholders are people who actually own a small piece of land and farm it. Which leads me on to the next bit. Enclosed farming. So back in the 16th century, we had lots of common land. What do I mean by common land? Sorry? Public land. So you must have, at some point, gone to sit and have some food on a common. Yeah? River. The monastery grounds down there. What are they called?
We're a wreck.
The wreck, but also it's built in an area. What's the area called? Down in River. Kersney Abbey, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah? Abbey, an old monastery site, that is common land. Yeah? It's land that anyone can actually use. We can't farm that land anymore, but back in the 16th century you could farm that land. So if the land was common, it meant that actually you could take a patch of it and farm it yourself. That could be your little patch. But what they then started to do was that they started to enclose farms, which meant that rich landowners would actually draw a boundary and create a wall around their land and say, that's mine, you can't farm it. Or if you are going to farm it, you're going to pay me rent. And of course, if you now have to pay rent for the land, you've even less money. Make sense? And as a result of that, a lot of people moved to the cities to find work. But there wasn't necessarily work in the cities. So that's point 2. Point 3, ladies and gentlemen, was a population explosion. So basically the birth rate went up and death rate fell, which meant that there were lots and lots more people. Went from 2.8 million people to 4 million during Elizabeth's reign. Now that actually says that within the country there was a lot, it was very settled, but of course that's a significant population increase. And the last thing, and actually this is very apt for what we're doing today. 1556, an outbreak of flu. Why would an outbreak of flu, because you think that would reduce the population, so surely that means that actually there's more to go around for the other people there. Why though would that make people even more impoverished?
They could have relied on someone.
Could have relied on them, yeah. That's not the main reason. Let me put it in a modern day context. We are surrounded by fruit farms. What's the biggest issue with the fruit farms right now? Who picks the fruit?
Anyone.
Not us. Where do the people come from who pick the fruit in Kent? They're European. They come across every single year for the season and they pick fruit. They can't come across this year. So they can't come across this year. They're you've heard of the term seasonal workers. Yeah? They're seasonal workers will come across, pick fruit during the winter or during the summer months, and that's what our farmers actually use. Without them, what's going to happen to fruit? Yeah, it's just going to rot. There won't be enough people to actually pick it. So if there's not enough people to pick fruit, you know at the end of the summer you go into the supermarket and it's full of Kentish apples? All the apples from local farms. Are they going to be there this year? Some of them will, but not all of them. What does that do to the price of an apple?
Increases it.
It increases it because it's now in demand, which means, of course, poor people can't afford it. Does that make sense? Now that's a modern day scenario, but if we're looking back to the idea that actually 200,000 farm workers actually died, therefore farms didn't actually produce product, therefore it wasn't put into the towns, therefore if you were poor, whatever product was there was more expensive, therefore you became poor. Does that make sense? And that's how it goes on. And actually we're seeing it in today's society right now, not to the same degree. So those are the 4 areas, ladies and gentlemen, just to go through: tudor mistakes, failures in agriculture, population explosion, flu outbreak. If you're doing this at home, ladies and gentlemen, the next task, create a spider diagram looking at those 4 areas. It's fairly self-explanatory. I would hope most of you can do the S/M task. Right, I'm just going to explain this and then we'll finish the video because I've gone on long enough. Within the piece of paper that you've got, so the Word document, it describes these 4 groups of people: the deserving, the undeserving, and the idle. Now these are 3 groups of people who actually the upper classes would actually deem poorer classes to fall into. The deserving were poor people who wanted a job, were able-bodied but couldn't get a job. So they were deserving in the eyes of rich people to actually be given charity. The undeserving were the people who were able-bodied, could get a job, but didn't want to get a job. And they saw them as beggars. There's some details in there about a book which was written about how do you recognise a beggar who's just trying to swindle you. Some very interesting ideas in there, including the one where, to make sure that people thought he was mad, he would put a chicken's head in his ear. So they would give him money because they thought he was mad. And then, of course, there's the idle, the people who just don't want to work. Read through the sheet, ladies and gentlemen, and then, as I suggest in the next slide, if you can create a table and complete it based on the documentation you have in front of you, create that table, complete it, and it says there at the bottom, read through Thomas Harmon's, which is also available for you, the cartoon strip. Which effect do you think this publication would have had on people's attitudes towards the poor? So what did people think of the poor? Wonderful. Thank you.